Okay, very good. Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Cook, and I'm the Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches. And the New York State Council of Churches represents about 7,500 congregations across the state of New York. We've been doing so since the late 19th century. And we're pleased to co-sponsor this town hall forum on the state budget with our close partner, New Yorkers for Fiscal Fairness. Ron Deutsch is in charge of that organization, and we have worked together for a number of years. And together, we've really sought to illuminate what is happening in Albany around budget priorities with an eye towards alleviating wealth inequality, poverty, and structural racism. While all of our congregations engage in charity and do good works like feeding the hungry and housing the poor, such charity, we are clear, alone is absolutely not sufficient. We are called by our Creator to do more than charity and to reach out to counter systems that are making people poor, to speak about injustice and be witnesses for people who are suffering because of these systemic injustices. We are focused on advocating for economic and racial justice through legislation, and we believe that laws and policies should focus on helping people who have historically been excluded, whether it is in Black and Brown communities, immigrants, or many other people. We're also very concerned about the ever-growing wealth gap in our economy, where the wealthy are getting wealthier, while people who are low and middle income are not getting wealthier, but are often getting poorer. We also seek to protect the environment and preserve the franchise to vote. In February, the Council of Churches presented its 2022 legislative ask, along with accompanying seminars which reflect our faith values and priorities. And you can view those on our website under Ecumenical Advocacy Day at www.nyscoc.org. Today, we're going to take a look at the political state of play in our capital, where we compare what is what are in the one House budget resolutions from the Senate and the Assembly, and compare those resolutions to what Governor Hochul proposed in her executive budget, which she laid out in January. We hope what we present will help you advocate with the governor and your legislators as we quickly move towards approval on a state budget, which is about 8 days away on April 1st. What you say could influence what gets decided, as the three people in a room, Governor Hochul, Senator Leader Stuart Cousins, and Speaker Carl Hastie, as they deliberate on a final budget package to be voted on by the legislature and signed by the governor. So we hope that this will be a space where you can explore these questions with us and learn how you can act. And we're going to lay out plenty of time for people to ask their questions, but we're going for the next hour to our panelists who are going to share with us their perspectives on the state budget. And the first person I want to introduce to you is Ron Deutsch from New Yorkers for Fiscal Fairness, who will offer a general overview of the issues around the state budget. Ron?
Thank you, Peter. Welcome, everybody. Thanks once again to the New York State Council of Churches for having me and being a partner with New Yorkers for Fiscal Fairness. We greatly appreciate it. I see a bunch of old friends on the call, so it's always nice to get together with everybody once again. But I'm going to talk a little bit, give you that 30,000-foot view. And I'm going to share some slides with you to kind of walk through some of this. So if you will indulge me, I am going to start with total spending in the budget. So total spending, right? That's all funds spending in the budget. The executive budget proposal was around $218 billion. So this includes our state operating funds, as well as all the federal funds that New York receives, as well as other miscellaneous revenue items and receipts. Now the Assembly and Senate are looking at increasing that by about $7 billion. So the all funds budget on the Assembly and Senate side is around $225 billion, which is a lot of money, right? It's never quite enough, but it's a lot of money. You know, last year's $212 billion budget was a record high. So really what's been happening, obviously, you know, we've gone from what we were looking at kind of during the COVID pandemic initially of a $60 billion multi-year deficit to around a $55 billion multi-year surplus. And obviously federal stimulus spending and revenue growth, largely attributable to last year's tax hikes on the wealthy, you know, basically really helped us move the needle on revenues this year. So we had more than we were anticipating. So the next slide, I talk a little bit about revenue consensus, right? So each year by March 1st, New York has to come to what's called a revenue consensus forecast. So the governor and Senate and the Assembly have to come to an agreement on how much money they think will be in the budget this year. And basically the Senate and the Assembly during this revenue forecast proposed that they were looking at more along the lines of about 800 million to about 1.2 billion more than the governor had anticipated in her financial plan laid out in the executive budget proposal. The Assembly proposal includes this reestimate and basically provides for a $831 million being used for various other things such as the earned income tax credit. But this is important because this lets us know how much money the Senate and the Assembly think we have more than what the governor is proposing. The other big kind of contentious issue that keeps getting a little bit more and more attention these days is the fact that we have been trying, or the governor has proposed putting a substantial amount of money in the rainy day fund. There basically are two funds. There's a rainy day fund. There's an economic uncertainty fund that was started last year as well. But the governor was really trying to bolster these rainy day funds substantially. And, you know, there's a big debate right now as to whether or not it's raining now and we should be using that money, or whether or not we should be saving it. You know, clearly there is a great deal of need right now that's going unmet. So one has to question whether or not we want to put that much money in the rainy day fund. It's certainly more than we've ever had before in that fund. But right now, you know, the governor was basically trying to increase that by about $5 billion this year alone. And the Assembly and Senate basically agreed to the reserve fund of $920 million in the actual rainy day fund. But they are basically spending the economic uncertainty fund that the governor had set aside on a variety of different items that have been needed for quite some time. So, and in fact, the Assembly basically is proposing withdrawing about 1.1 billion more than the 4.1 billion to pay for a number of different items in their one house budget proposal. So there are other revenue issues that are at play right now as well that we're looking at potentially spending a lot of money on, right? One is, and you all may be hearing about this, certainly something that's gaining a lot more traction in the press and among certain lawmakers, is this notion of a gas tax holiday. So the proposal would be to spend about $700 million on eliminating the gas tax for a period of time, with the notion that, that's going to help people who are worried about gas tax or gas price increases. And this is one of the ways that the governor is looking to address it. But, I think the reality is that wealthy people tend to benefit from that more. Many poor people are in fact utilizing public transportation, which is in fact where that money could potentially be coming from. So they're talking about using general fund monies to supplant that $700 million that would have come basically from some MTA funds as well. So it's a little disconcerting that they're looking at doing this right now. The other one that troubles me is this property tax rebate program, right? We're looking to spend $2.2 billion on this, and both houses of the legislature are in agreement with this as well. We did away with many of these property tax rebates because, they were ineffective. It's not an effective mechanism to deliver relief to people. It's not really targeted the way it should be targeted, much like, say, an earned income tax credit, which could potentially go a long way to helping families in need and lower income families. So the other piece of this is we're accelerating the middle class tax cuts. You may remember back in, I think it was 2017, we put in place a multi-year plan of about 8 years to provide what they called middle class tax cuts. Those do go up to about $320,000 a year. For people earning that much, and the majority of that 700 million actually goes to people at the top end. When you're cutting someone's taxes by 1/10 or 0.2%, who's making $50,000 a year, that just doesn't amount to enough to make any kind of difference. So even though the legislature is agreeing to the property tax rebates and the acceleration of the middle class tax cuts, we should keep in mind that that is money that could potentially be used to fill gaps in other areas. So I did mention the earned income tax credit, and it was not in Governor Hochul's.
Hello.
Hello. If we
Yes.
could, if you
Yes.
Wait, could you, because people muted.
51160. Hold on a minute. Let me turn this down. Listening.
Roberta, could you mute yourself? Thank you.
Sorry.
No problem, Roberta. So the earned income tax credit, let me get back to that. Basically, the governor does not have this at all in her proposal, or executive budget proposal, but the Assembly and Senate have agreed basically that they want to include an expansion of the earned income tax credit in their budget proposal. So it's costs about $731 million. And what it would do is basically increase the state EITC by about 25%. So right now, the earned income tax credit is set at 30% of the federal earned income tax credit, and that would increase it to 37.5% of the federal credit. Would also double the benefit for low-income individuals with no no qualifying children. And it would also be expanded to include taxpayers with ITINs or individual taxpayer identification numbers. So that's also an important step in the right direction, I believe. And it also makes the EITC credit advanceable. So you could get it quarterly instead of all in one lump sum. So if you're having difficulty throughout the year, obviously making ends meet, being able to get this credit quarterly would make a lot of sense. So we are definitely supporting an expansion of this earned income tax credit, and honestly think that this makes a lot more sense because it's really targeted. It's really, targeted at those who are most impacted by these inflation increases. So this would be a really great proposal to see in the final budget. There's a number of increases to the executive budget proposal, right? We talked about the fact that the Assembly and Senate are looking at $7 to potentially $8 billion increases in the executive budget to what's already in the executive budget proposal. So just to talk a little bit about some of those additional spending items, they're looking at $3.2 billion on healthcare, $2.3 billion in housing, an additional $2 billion in childcare, nearly $1 billion in higher ed, $500 million or so for residential utility arrears relief, and then another 200 million or so, another 200 million or so for assigned counsel. So the other piece Peter just wanted me to mention, because we didn't have anybody on to talk about this, is wages. And I'm sure Dee Dee and Rona will talk a little bit about the fact that childcare workers and home healthcare workers desperately need a raise. I would also suggest that human service workers who are, again, overwhelmingly female, 2/3 are female. 2/3 of those full-time workers are women of color. 46% are women of color. And these workers have been denied a cost of living adjustment under Governor Cuomo for a full decade. And that has really resulted in their wages dropping substantially and not keeping pace with inflation over the last decade. But the governor has proposed a COLA of about 5.4% for these workers, but we think that's pretty low due to the fact that it hasn't been increased. I mean, the reality is that over that last decade, human service workers have lost about $500 million in pay as a result of not getting COLAs each year and having them deferred by the legislature. So, that's resulted in about 15% of all of these workers, many of whom are trying to qualify people for public assistance, are themselves qualifying for public assistance. So, I think, once again, the budget, we need to speak to the morality of the budget. What are our priorities in the budget? And I sure think that providing pay increases for childcare workers, for home healthcare workers, for human service workers is a really good use of dollars, and it will pay dividends well into the future because the return on investment will be great and the benefits to society is just as great. So I'm going to stop there. I will turn it back over to you, Peter, and I look forward to hearing our next presenter.
I just had one quick comment just to reinforce that some state expenditures are more economically productive than others. And giving tax cuts at the top generally does not generate the same kind of economic activity as investing in wages and other programs for people who are poor and low wealth or middle class. So we can talk more about that later. And the next person I want to introduce is Rona Shapiro, who's going to speak about home care wages, and she is with SEIU 1199. So welcome, Rona.
Okay, well, first I want to thank you, Reverend, for inviting me. I want to thank you for your advocacy work on behalf of home care workers, and I'm hearing on behalf of a lot of other people. And I want to thank Ron, because now you got me even more angry knowing some of the stuff that's in the budget. So I don't know about a rainy day fund, but it's been raining on home care workers and consumers for many years. And there's a crisis in New York State. There's a crisis for both consumers and there's a crisis for those who give care. And we represent over 60,000 home care workers, healthcare heroes that throughout New York State that basically have been ignored, are still unfortunately invisible. Not only the workers who are majority women of color, many immigrant women, but so are the people they take care of, the consumers, people living with disabilities that want to live their life in dignity, are being forced into institutions because they cannot find a home care worker. They cannot find a home care worker because in your fair part of the state, workers are making $13.20, and that includes Buffalo, Rochester, outside of New York City. In New York City, we were able to win 4 years ago a minimum wage of $15. So I don't know how many of you live in New York City, but the only way you can pay a $3,000 rent in New York City or in Queens or in Brooklyn or wherever is to have many people living in that home. And we're saying that this year is not a year for people who made a lot of money during the pandemic. It's for those people who suffered during the pandemic. We lost many, many home care workers in New York, and the crisis is even worse outside of New York, going upstate, Long Island, Westchester, Buffalo, Hudson Valley, Albany. You cannot find a home care worker. And the reason being that 1320, there's no guaranteed hours. You know, you can have a case and tomorrow you won't have a case. And it's very difficult to plan a budget on this kind of money. We think it's, let me see a good word that I'm not cursing. It's outrageous. It really is outrageous that the governor, and I am hoping more from her, she's a woman, you know, I would hope she has a better understanding of what caregiving means to those who need care. I am hoping the governor will change her mind. I am hoping you find people on this call will call the governor and ask her to put fair pay for home care workers in this budget. She hasn't even offered them a COLA, a 5% COLA. The home care workers have not gotten a raise in 4 years. She has not offered a COLA. She has offered a bonus. That's like giving somebody a tip, a bonus that most of the home care workers probably won't even get because it's going forward and you need to work a certain amount of hours. So this state is in crisis. And if you talk to consumers who need home care workers, their stories are heartbreaking because they contribute to society. They have jobs, but they have jobs because they have home care workers. And all of us, if we are lucky enough to live that long, and I'm not that far away from being old, I'm already old, but you know, we will need a home care worker, and we want a home care worker who takes care of our loved ones, our mothers, our fathers, our children, our neighbors. We want them to think about taking care of our loved ones. We don't want them to have to worry, are they going to pay their rent? Are they going to have enough car fare to get to work? And that is the reality of home care workers. And the workers, I don't know how many of you are familiar with home care workers who have had home care workers, but this is a mission. Not everyone could be a home care worker. Not everyone could be a healthcare worker. It's a mission. If you do this kind of work for people who really need you, who don't have families that want to take care of you, and you keep doing it for $13.20, you're a very special person. $13.20 an hour, driving upstate, which is, I guess, where you, I don't know if you consider Albany upstate. I live in Yonkers, but they consider me upstate. But if you consider the hours that home care workers spend getting to their consumer's house in snow, in rain, in hurricanes and tornadoes, that we haven't had, I think we did have a tornado recently, a little tornado. But anyway, they still get in their cars. They still get on the trains in New York City, which, you know, for a while and even now are very dangerous. You know, there is unfortunately a lot of people on the subways that should be in housing and should be taken care of, but they're not. And the home care workers were the first people during the pandemic when a lot of us were able to stay remote. They got out of their house, they walked into subways that were not safe. We cannot let people go without care, and we cannot let givers go without fair pay. And you know, I don't want to be redundant, but I will keep saying this until it is in the budget. We've been to Albany every single week with our home care members. We have delivered 10,000 Have a Heart cards to Governor Hochul. Thanks to Reverend Peter Cook, we had over 350 signatures, faith for fair pay. So we have made our story very clear. Consumers have made their request very clear. There is money in this budget. There is a rainy day, and these workers do not have any freaking umbrella. And so they, you know, it is priorities. Everything is important to somebody in this budget. But it is time for workers. I don't know what a human service worker is, to be honest. I have no clue what that is. I mean, it seems to me childcare workers work with humans, home care work with humans. I'm not sure what it means, but all I'm saying, this is time to put priorities on the workers and the consumers in New York State that are suffering. And in the words of Tish James, who talked about the feminization of poverty, that's what we're talking about in home care. Probably that's what we're talking about in childcare. That's probably what we're talking about in human services, whatever. So I am really making a plea that that home care workers, home health aid, caring for others be a priority in this budget. And so I am asking, and Ron pointed out a lot of places where that money does not have to go to. The governor is obviously trying to win an election. She wants to make everybody happy, but she's certainly not making people who are in need of services or the people who give those services happy. So please, I didn't come with any fancy power presentation. I just have a lot of passion and to get this done, because it is heartbreaking to hear stories. It is heartbreaking. So anyway, thank you. I don't want to keep you too long, but I really appreciate the time. I'll be up in Albany Tuesday, hoping to have another Faith. Oh my God, the name, Faith for Fair Pay. And I encourage you all to please call Governor Hochul and say, have a heart, have a heart. So thank you so much. I really appreciate. I don't know who you all are, but I'm sure you're a fine group of people. So thank you.
All right, thank you. The next person we're going to have speak is Mark Haney from New York Health. Mark, want to know if you could talk particularly about coverage for all, but if there are any other highlights in the budget, that would be great.
Sure, thank you. And it's fitting that I come right after Rona. It's a really important issue. We're all working to make sure that healthcare workers get the pay that they deserve, and that we actually have a healthcare workforce that can meet the demand. Right now, we have people already deemed eligible for these services, and there are just nobody to provide those services across the state. So it's about building and maintaining and sustaining a long-term care workforce in our communities. So I want to salute Rona and 1199 and the Fair Pay for Home Care campaign, because they're doing really terrific work. And, you know, we're all pushing that, rooting for you, etc. So thanks. My name's Mark Hannay. I'm with Metro New York Healthcare for All, which is a community labor coalition here in the New York City area. 1199 is one of our member organizations. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the healthcare issues that are in play in the budget very quickly. I have a one-page chart to show if somebody can make it possible for me to do a screen share. If not, I can just talk from it. But before we
do a co-host.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. But just to brush up my own bona fides a little bit with this crowd. My father was a Methodist pastor in the Western New York region, and during his career was always active in interfaith and interdenominational bodies, really believed in that approach, and also focused a lot of his own ministry on social justice work, as well as pastoral work. So I'm familiar with what all of you do and so forth, and really glad to have you part of the team. So let me just share my screen then. Let me see, and now I have to do this thing where I do a slideshow and make it show. Come on, there we are. There we are. Okay, so giving credit where credit is due. This is a slide I'm borrowing and adapted a bit from my colleague Amanda Dunker at the Community Service Society of New York. So these are sort of from the health advocates' point of view. These are things that we've been focusing on in the budget process that's now underway in Albany. And here's where there already are areas of agreement between the governor and the legislature. So there's some good news here. They're extending Medicaid eligibility for all low-income people on Medicare. These would be people over age 65, people with long-term disabilities, up to 138% of the federal poverty level. And this would make them on par with all other people who are already getting Medicaid. For some reason, this population was left behind under the Affordable Care Act changes that were made to Medicaid. So now we're bringing them up to that same level that everybody else gets. And that's a good thing. And we're eliminating any asset test that heretofore has been required. So they can keep their savings for retirement and so forth. It's not an issue in terms of whether you can get on Medicaid or not anymore. And all parties are in agreement on this. They're eliminating premiums in the Child Health Plus program for families at certain income levels who have been required to pay a $9 a month premium. They're getting rid of that premium altogether. Turns out it's more hassle to collect it than it's worth, and kids were dropping out of the program, and we don't want to see that happen. They're also expanding benefits under the Child Health Plus program to match those that kids and families that qualify for Medicaid get. So they get the same benefits whether they're in Child Health Plus or whether they're in Medicaid. The state has had a special program it created several years ago under the Affordable Care Act called the Essential Plan, which is available to low-income people and families who, for whatever reason, don't qualify for Medicaid. And it actually goes up to higher income levels than Medicaid. And we have nearly 1 million New Yorkers that are on this program now. It's a smashing success. Currently covers people and families up to 200% of the federal poverty level. The governor has proposed to raise that up to 250%. So that's a good thing. All parties have agreed that they want to provide more money to the Community Health Advocates Program. This is a statewide network of nonprofits that help people with all kinds of problems they have using their health insurance, getting health care, et cetera, no matter whether they've got Medicaid or CHIP or coverage through a job, or they buy their own coverage. However you get it, you got a problem using it, this program is here. And it's also something that was created under the Affordable Care Act and has been a smashing success here in New York. the unfortunate thing is that nobody's providing any new additional money for the navigators, who are the folks that actually help people enroll in an insurance program, be it public or private. So as Ron was talking before, we're getting a cost of living adjustment that help the people who help once you get insurance in place, but no new funding for the people who actually get you enrolled in the coverage. So that's a problem. And there's unfortunately no changes to how the state doles out funding to hospitals from the indigent care pool. This is a funding that's supposed to go to hospitals that serve large numbers of poor people on Medicaid who are uninsured. There's been proposals kicking around for several years now to adjust that formula so that the funding really goes to the safety net hospitals that serve large numbers of those people. So unfortunately, we didn't see any progress in the budget on that. The differences are between the different proposals out there. The governor proposes to extend Medicaid for women postpartum after delivery from the current 2-month period out to 1 year. That's a good thing. However, some categories of immigrants will not be eligible for this expansion, even though for many, many years, our Medicaid for Pregnant Women program has always covered all women, no questions asked, no immigrant issues, etc. So this is a change in policy that is problematic from the governor's office. Fortunately, the Assembly and the Senate have said, yes, this is a good idea to do the extension, and we're going to have no exclusions. We're going to cover all women, no questions asked. Another proposal is a proposal to extend and open up our essential plan to all low-income immigrants, regardless of their immigration status. This is what's known as the coverage for all proposal. The governor's budget was silent on this idea. It's something that's also been kicking around for a number of years now. But fortunately, the Assembly and the Senate have put it in their one House budget bills, and there's a lot of enthusiasm and support in the legislature to do this. Some other states are already moving forward on this, most notably California and Illinois, so it's time for New York to join the pack. There's a proposal in the governor's budget to revise the Medicaid global cap formula to allow Medicaid to grow more than has been allowed. This formula is something that came in under former Governor Cuomo about a decade ago. Up to that point, we never had any kind of cap on the program. If you qualified, you got in it, you got the services, no questions asked. But a governor was able to oppose a global cap. The current governor is saying we can adjust it some, which has been needed. And the Senate and the Assembly said, we don't need a global cap on Medicaid. We don't think that's a good idea. The program needs to grow with demand and need. We do have an aging population, et cetera, et cetera. So let's just get rid of it and go back to what we did prior to Governor Cuomo. And then, of course, this issue of pay for home care workers that you heard about before. The governor is proposing some one-time bonuses, and the Assembly and the Senate are saying, no, we want to provide permanent wage increases. So that's kind of where things stand from the healthcare standpoint. I'll turn things back to you, Peter.
Hey, thanks, Mark. That's so helpful. Really grateful you laid that out for us. Next, I'd like to introduce Tom Speaker, who is with Reinvent Albany.
Hi, yes, I'm Tom Speaker, policy analyst at Reinvent Albany. We've been helping win a more transparent, accountable New York government since 2010 by passing laws to improve open data and the freedom of information law, passing anti-corruption reforms, and curb business subsidies. Thanks to the New York Council of Churches and Ron Deutsch, of course, at the New Yorkers for Fiscal Fairness for hosting. And then thanks as well, of course, to all the legislators and advocates who have been working hard to bring transparency and accountability to business subsidies in New York. So I'll be fairly brief. I'll start by saying that New York State spends about $5 billion every year on business subsidies. That can be through huge mega deals that give hundreds of millions of dollars to giant companies like Tesla and Amazon. And more often it's through smaller deals that give businesses tax breaks, supposedly in exchange for creating jobs. Now, of course, that sounds great to just give a certain company X number of dollars and in exchange they'll create jobs. But unfortunately, most studies have found that these types of business subsidies are a bad use of taxpayer funds. One example that we like to cite is Tim Bartik, a nationally respected economist at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, did a study where he found that subsidies affect where businesses decide to locate at most 25% of the time, and at worst 2% of the time, meaning that at least 75% of the time, taxpayers are giving huge corporations billions of dollars that could instead be going to childcare, public health, clean water, and other vital public services. So since 2014, Reinvent Albany and friends like Ron Deutsch have been working to pass a database of deals bill like the one that was included in the Senate and Assembly budgets, but unfortunately not in the governor's budget. Passing this bill will help us figure out how much in state subsidies individual businesses are getting from the dozens of state subsidy programs that are out there. It will include a uniform definition of job that will allow apples to apples comparisons of how much different state programs spend to create one job. And the reason we're asking for this is that we don't really have much of that data. We do not have a very good sense of how much New York is spending in total on these programs. That $5 billion I mentioned earlier is an estimate. In many cases, we don't know which companies are receiving those subsidies and how much they're receiving. So that's what the point of a database of deals is. Back in 2021, under Governor Cuomo, Empire State Development did set up a database of economic incentives, which was a step forward, but it leaves out a lot of crucial information. It leaves out programs created prior to 2018. It doesn't let us differentiate between types of jobs being created or let us see how much businesses are receiving in total. So if this bill passes in the budget, which we hope it does, it's sponsored by Senator Comrie and Assembly Member Wallace, that'll give us better data to figure out which programs, which business subsidy programs are creating jobs and which are not. And then we can use that data to get rid of the programs that are just throwing money at businesses and put those taxpayer funds where they're needed most, like in the public services that I mentioned earlier. And then finally, in addition to the $5 billion in business subsidy spending, New York State spends at least $100 billion on contracts every year. Unfortunately, oversight of many of these contracts by the state comptroller was removed in 2011 at the behest of Governor Cuomo. And our belief is that comptroller oversight of state contracts is needed to protect taxpayer funds from waste and abuse or fraud. The removal of the comptroller's oversight powers led directly to the 2015 Buffalo Billion bid rigging scandal, in which multiple Cuomo donors and allies were convicted of wire fraud for having steered nearly $1 billion in contracts to companies that contributed to the governor's campaign, which, in short, is pay to play. The good news is that both the Assembly and Senate budgets contain proposals to restore those powers. Yet again, unfortunately, the governor's does not. We prefer the Assembly version because that would fully restore what was removed in 2011. And we really believe that giving these powers back to the comptroller will help prevent another Buffalo Billion-like scandal and protect taxpayer funds. So that's all I have. Thanks for allowing me to speak.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom. And again, this is so helpful because we really need to think about the wise stewardship of our resources and not be wasting taxpayer dollars. So I'm making Dee Dee Hill, who's policy director, political director from the Schuyler Institute, who's going to talk about childcare. Welcome, Dee Dee. I just made you the co-host.
All right, I'll try not to like boot everyone or something. Sometimes you make me host and then you wish you hadn't. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Dee Dee Hill, Policy Director at the Schuyler Center for Analysis and Advocacy. And it's been so great to hear all the presentations. Yeah, there's lots of opportunity in this budget. I'm gonna focus on the opportunity, but I also wanted to a shout out to Rona and the amazing advocacy around the home care workers. I'm gonna focus a lot today on childcare in the workforce. And when I think about the caregivers in my life, who I am most fond of, is the home care workers who took care of my stepfather, who suffered from Parkinson's for a decade and just passed away. And in the same breath, I think about the childcare educators who helped me raise my kids, and who were like my best teachers too, as to how to be a good parent. So, we are long overdue to pay this overwhelmingly women of color workforce who have been undervalued for too long. And this has got to be the year that we turn that corner. So let's just make that happen. So I'm going to try to share my screen. So I'm going to talk about childcare to start, and I'm going to get a little into the weeds, but I'll try not to go too deep. Oh, wait, let me just start the slideshow here. Oops. Sorry, I'm sort of. Okay. How does that look? Does that look all right?
Yeah, great.
Okay, great. So, first, I said I was going to try to be optimistic. This is for childcare. This is really a historic moment in New York State. Childcare has long been underfunded in New York State, and it just largely overlooked. But the pandemic, as has been the case for a number of issues, it really laid bare how essential childcare is for the well-being, the functioning of New York families, of businesses, of communities. Of course, this is something that most of us, all of us with children, many of us who are just paying attention have long known. But really, this reality became very, very clear during the pandemic. And so because of that, and because I would say because of the tireless advocacy of New York, the New York childcare community, and particularly childcare providers and parents, there is more attention on childcare this year than we have ever seen. And that has resulted in two, I'm not going to say three, I'm going to say two extraordinarily strong budget proposals. So the Senate and the Assembly budget proposals are really strong. And if we take pieces from each of them, they could really set New York on a short path to universal childcare, which is really what the state needs, what families need, what businesses need. The governor's proposal, and I'll walk through this chart, but I'll walk through it quickly. But as you can tell just by glancing at the governor's proposal was underwhelming. absolutely the weakest of the three proposals. That said, she is a leader who understands the importance of childcare. She has many personal experiences of relying on childcare to lead her successful career. And we think with the right encouragement, she will come along and sign on to a really, really strong investment in childcare. So just a few things I'm going to point out from this chart. And then if you want to study it, you know, in your spare time, I'll make sure you get a copy. Critical to the investments in childcare, we need investments in 3 areas, and we need them at exactly the same time, because a failure to do that will further destabilize a sector that is already really on its last legs. And so the 3 components of the Child Care Communities Ask, which are reflected in these budget proposals, is first, we need to expand access to high quality childcare, and we need to make it affordable for more families. The principal way of providing affordable childcare is through what New York State calls its subsidy system. They are essentially like vouchers for childcare. And as you can see under eligibility expansion, we have 3 different proposals. The Senate's proposal is the most expansive and will reach the most families. It expands access to subsidies to to families earning with incomes of 300% of the federal poverty level. This is absolutely something that New York needs to do it this year. The other really important piece of the Senate proposal is the Senate proposal will expand subsidies to all families without exception. It will eliminate currently existing immigration status requirements, as well as activity and employment requirements. These requirements present all kinds of obstacles for families that prevent many families who need childcare most from being able to access subsidies. And further, this sort of decoupling childcare from all of these requirements would be transformational. It will really put New York on the right path to universal childcare. Another strength of the Senate proposal that we're very supportive of is it really reduces, it envisions families having, middle income families still having to contribute some copays, but it would make childcare free this year to families with incomes of less than 300% of the federal poverty level. That's exactly what families need right now. And then at the bottom of the chart, and I'm realizing there are a few things that are not on this chart that I'll just highlight as well. One other really important thing to highlight, New York's child care subsidy system, it serves families with children 6 weeks old through or until 13. This is what we call school age after school care, critical for working families. There has long been a mismatch between the school day and work days. If you don't have high quality after school, families can't work. Children have no place to go after school. And so the Senate proposal would not cover those school-age children. So we are strongly supportive of the Assembly proposal in that respect. It recognizes that we have a fully integrated subsidy system that serves young children through school age. And then finally, the pieces of the proposal that are not on the screen, but are of utmost importance are: one, we need direct workforce supports for all the reasons that Rona talked about with the home care workforce. So the childcare workforce, about 65% of the childcare workforce earns wages that are so low in New York State that they are eligible for public benefits. And so the Senate proposes some $3,000 bonuses, which are not enough, but would be a stepping stone to higher wages. Or the Assembly has a similar, although stronger, proposal around wages that we're supportive of. And then the third piece of what is needed to stabilize childcare is we need to raise the reimbursement rates, which is the rates for subsidies, which have been artificially low for decades. And both the Senate and the Assembly proposal include strong proposals to increase those rates, and we support them. So I'm going to leave you with one thought about childcare, and that is that we need to see no less than $3 billion in investment in childcare this year. And I think with that, I'm gonna kick it back to you, Peter. And in the Q&A, I don't, if you want me to talk about the child tax credit, I can do that. But I don't want to hold things up right now.
All right. Thank you, Dee Dee.
Oh, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Just give me a second. Sorry.
Okay, no worries. So we haven't been entirely sequential here because I put people in based on availability a little bit. Who goes first or second does not ascribe any level of higher importance. It's all important here. It's all interconnected. And in that spirit, I want to introduce Bob Cohen from Citizen Action, who has been with Citizen Action for a very long time and is really an expert on so many things, but certainly around climate provisions in the budget. So, Bob?
Thanks, Peter, for the kind introduction and also for inviting me today. And one thing I want to say that I'm not an expert on is technology. So forgive me if I look like I'm floating in a haze. I'm not. I was originally on an iPad and I didn't realize that it was out of power. So I'm using my defective laptop. So I'm here. So anyway, I just want to provide a little bit of a context before I get into the budget, because I think climate is a little different than some of the other things, because it isn't just an issue for us of amount of money. And, you know, I'm not going to focus a little bit on how much money goes to particular programs, but have to give a little bit of a context. And I'd like to thank my old friend Ron and a couple of other people for setting up this point, or actually reminding me I should make this point, which is usually when we talk about the budget, in the years many of us have been doing this, what we're talking about is an era of austerity. And usually what some of us say is we've got to tax the wealthy or raise income. And I think it's important to mention that this is not a year of where the state is, I wouldn't say the state is flush with cash, but it's not a case where they can make that as austerity argument. And as several people have already said before me, in addition to the fact that the state is doing well in terms of cash, there are a number of proposals that are not how we would, as as progressive as an advocates and good government people spending money. And it's already been mentioned, the property tax, the gas tax, holiday, etc. So, you know, I have to do the qualification that on some of these issues, including the main thing I'm going to be talking about, the Environmental Bond Act, neither we, Citizen Action of New York, I should have said, is a multi-issue progressive organization. New York Renews, we're on the steering committee, is the largest climate coalition in New York State, has over 200 organizations. Neither one of us have a formal position on either of those two things, the gas tax and the Environmental Bond Act, but I'd like to keep it real and talk about the reality of where the budget is on those issues, particularly the Bond Act. So the other one thing for context is that I'm not going to tell people here that there's a climate crisis. I think you all know that, but it's important to also know that right now, for people who don't follow climate, New York is in the first couple of years of implementation of a landmark climate law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed in 2019, was effective in 2020. And what that law did in really basic terms from a 10,000-foot level is two things. It reduced or mandated the reduction of greenhouse gases in New York State that produce climate change. By 2050 requires essentially an 85% reduction in greenhouse gases that produce climate change, and also has a number of really important social justice provisions. So much of what we do in climate, although I won't have the opportunity to go through this, intersects with what many of the previous speakers have talked about. So there are possibilities of improving people's housing situation. There are possibilities of improving people's health, etc. So we're not just talking about, you know, mitigation of storms, as incredibly important that is. And they're also, when I say social justice provisions, for example, one of the most important provisions of the CLCPA, the climate law in New York, is that it requires 40% of certain energy funds, other funds to be devoted to disadvantaged communities, which shorthand terms is communities of color and low-income communities that have suffered the impact of pollution and climate change. So that's what we're talking about. We're not just talking about storms, as important as that is. So New York Renews, which is the coalition we're part of, proposed $15 billion this year for climate. I don't think it will shock anybody to know that we haven't gotten a fraction of that. I want to just say that we didn't pull that out of the air. There are two bases, at least, for that expenditure of money that we believe should have been in the budget. One is a study we've done by that we contracted for the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass at Amherst, said that about $30 billion needs to be spent to do the climate transformation, the transformation to a renewable energy economy that we believe is necessary, although that is public and private funds, but it still means public funds have to be a significant role. And then New York State, NYSERDA, has said, and it was adopted by this group called the Climate Action Council, which is this uber body of state agencies and public representatives, has said that we need to spend at least $10 billion. So we didn't, again, pull just $15 billion out of the air. It could be argued that we need even more. So New York Renews proposal, just briefly, wanted to use a third of the money for big picture projects like electric buses that will reduce pollution, a third for smaller projects like weatherization in disadvantaged communities, a third to help low and moderate income New Yorkers pay for anticipated increased energy costs, and a much smaller amount to help workers who will be impacted by the transition away from renewables, not because we don't care about workers, because it turns out there aren't many fossil fuel workers in New York, so you don't need as much money to make them whole. So what happened so there's really, for reasons of time, I'm really going to try to get the state budget in climate. It's obviously more complicated than that, into three big issues that I think are pressing. The first is money. It's really, I have not been able, and I don't know if anybody who has been able to do, because it's not one budget line like childcare or some of the other things that have been talked about. It's very hard, at least I don't have the capacity to make a comparison and say, oh, of that 15 billion, we've gotten X amount. I think it's safe to say there are expenditures of, a few $100 million in climate, but in many cases they do things that government should be doing anyway, and they have positive climate impacts. So it's a little hard to make comparisons. But most importantly, I want to talk about the Environmental Bond Act, because it will almost certainly pass the legislature in the next 2 weeks. And it will be before us. We'll get to vote on it. Again, we don't have any formal position. And we can go in the Q&A. I'll be happy to get into a little bit more detail about that. But basically, here's where it is. The governor proposed $4 billion for the Bond Act this year. The Senate added $2 billion to that for $6 billion. So it's the most ambitious of the three proposals. And the Assembly was in the middle at $5 billion. They all have different purposes for this money. And different programs it would go to. So, so I just want to say on that, first of all, it's an Environmental Bond Act, and I'm not a Climate Bond Act, so I'm not in any way trying to disparage at all. I support that things like wetlands protection and water systems and all those kinds of things. But it's important to remember when you compare it with the $15 billion New York Renews thinks is important, that even the $6 billion the Senate says is a small fraction, and it isn't just for climate. The Senate spends roughly about $3 billion for what they call climate change mitigation. And the other important thing, if you only remember one thing I said today on this, is the $6 billion in the case of the Senate and the $4 billion in terms of the governor is bonds over about a 30-year period. I would love if Ron wants to correct me, but my understanding is that the length of time depends on how they issue the bonds, and 30 years is the typical. So I'm not sure that's the exact, but the point is it's over many years. So if you want to do a simple math, arithmetic thing, 30 years, 30 into 6 billion is 200 million. So, and maybe, a half or a third of that is climate. So we're talking about maybe $100 or $200 million, and we thought we needed 5 billion. So that's obviously a very, very rough comparison, but it gives you an idea how they didn't meet the need. Plus, bonding has all the problems people know about, borrowing. It's going to add unnecessary costs. I don't understand why they simply didn't put a couple of $100 million in, if that's all they want to do for climate. And I'm not in the business of giving political advice to the Democrat majority or the Senate majority, but I think it's worth mentioning that three of the four ballot measures last year were voted down. So I'm not sure it's the greatest politics either, but that's what they opted to do. There were other, things I think it's important to do in climate. The governor proposed $500 million to develop offshore wind. There's some other things that are really important, but the Bond Act is the major thing. But I want to do two other issues because as I think most people here know, the budget just doesn't deal with money, it deals with policy issues. So it's worth mentioning really quickly. The governor put in this arcane thing called the Clean Fuel Standard, which basically says that 20%, they want to reduce the carbon content of transportation fuels in New York State. And it has problems from an economic justice and environmental justice perspective, because there's no protections as in the climate law to ensure that, for example, they don't use the money to pollute in Brooklyn, and then they can, under this proposal, polluters can pay for credits to get out of the obligations of the 20% fuel standard. So it not only is a bad solution, the Clean Fuel Standard, one of the worst things they could do, both from a climate and environmental justice perspective. Why did they do it? It seems pretty clear, because there has been a major campaign since the CLCPA, Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, passed on the part of the fossil fuel industry and the utilities, since they lost for whatever reason, and they allowed the law to pass, to find ways to maintain their way of doing business, while claiming that they support climate remediation. So, if you have clean fuels, so-called, it means you can still have your pipelines. I mean, that's, the sort of the basic thing. One positive thing, and there's actually a number, but for reasons of time, I just wanted to mention one, that's a source of big dispute in the budget, but it's actually a positive thing, is the governor put in appliance standards and building standards. There is a disagreement between the governor, who wants to have 100% electric buildings by 2027, and the legislature 2024. But I think that that's the biggest positive I can see from the budget, that we're assuming it stays in, that there are going to be mandates that after a certain period of time, if you won't be able to, if you're a local official, won't be able to give a permit unless it meets some standards for electrification of the buildings. And buildings are the largest source of greenhouse gases in New York. So, that is the positive thing. And if I could add really quickly one other non-budget thing, I know we don't have time, but I hope people try to follow this scoping plan process, which is how we're going to redesign climate in New York State. So I would urge you to visit the New York News webpage for information on how you can become involved with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. We're supposed to close at 4:30. I might push 5 minutes later, but it's important that we lay all this out. And so I'm now like to welcome Isaiah Thompson, who is the policy director at New York Housing Conference, to talk about housing.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I know we were short on time, so I don't think there's any need to convince anyone here that the housing crisis is serious. We're seeing record levels of homelessness in the state at more than 91,000 people, and the shortage is worst at low income when we look at what the percentage of income people are paying for rent. So just a bit of context was that our group pulled together about 15 others and put together recommendations for the state budget, which we pulled together. We wanted a 5-year housing plan similar to what the state did in 2016, and this came up to about 34 different programs, which we saw as important, and about 30 other legislative priorities, with a housing plan over 5 years, with that money adding up to about $6 billion. With that context, I think if we look at what the one House budget did, both the Assembly and the Senate, they were good and they came very close to exactly that. The Assembly budget did have a what they call a 5-year housing plan, which is just money that is meant to be spent over the course of the period of that time, to about 6.2 billion. The Senate was also similar at about almost 5.1. With different programs were in different or inside the housing plan and not inside the housing plan, so it's kind of hard to match up. But generally, we look at them as doing a pretty good job, as coming close to meeting the priorities we needed. The governor's 5-year housing plan was at 4.5, and so this includes things that they really agreed on. Which was great for housing and affordable housing in New York. Capital for construction, specifically when it comes to a senior housing program, for small developments, supportive housing. They came all and met with what we wanted for supportive housing, which was 1.5 billion, which is a major investment in supportive housing, which is needed because I think we know is like 1 in 4 people who are eligible for supportive housing in New York City at least don't get it, and I'm sure it's similar elsewhere in the state. So when it comes to the big spending on preservation and construction, all 3 budgets did pretty well in agreeing, even on the numbers there. So where we will come to the differences are and some of the programmatic and also the legislative things. So the housing access voucher program, or HAVP, which was sponsored by the housing chairs Kavanaugh and Sibowitz, that was put in the one House budgets with $250 million in both. I can go over if there's any time for Q&A on the specifics of that program, but it's really important with rental assistance at the statewide level, for people who are experiencing homelessness or on the cusp of experiencing homelessness. It was a really big thing that was in the one House budgets, but not in the governor's bill. And also, we had ERAP and LRAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which was the federal program which we got money for people who were experiencing, have rental arrears because of COVID. Both houses put funds towards those programs. ERAP being for just the tenants, and LRAP meaning that you could send the money to the legislature. The difference between the programs are not as important, but the Senate did allow for $1 billion to be spent towards that rental assistance for people with arrears because of COVID, and the Assembly asked for an even bigger amount at 1.25 for ERAP, and then 400 million for LRAP. There seems to be an idea that at the state level that they want the federal government to give money for this anti-eviction effort. Really, based off of what we're hearing, it doesn't seem like we're going to get the amount we need. So we're going to need that state money, and that's really important that ends up in the adopted budget, because the governor did not include any ERAP or LRAP funds in her budget specifically. There also was public housing outside of New York City was invested in both one House budgets, but specifically NYCHA capital was included 500 million in both the Assembly and Senate bills. And I think we're trying to go over some of the most important points. There's also the Honda legislation, which is for hotel conversions inside the city. And there's the legislative proposal that was inside of the one House budgets as well, put 150 million more into the program. There's been a lot of issues with spending this money. This money can be used outside of New York City, which is something that's really important for conversion of hotels into affordable housing. The way the program is built, there's been a lot of issues with getting that money actually out to some of these rehabs. But one of the things that we're pushing, which could be included in a final budget, we're hearing, is sort of changes to the regulations around hotels so that it can make it easier for these rehabs actually happen, which, you know, they're very expensive and difficult rehabs, but it's as California has shown, potential, you know, great place to find housing, especially for hotels that are underwater because of the pandemic.
Okay.
Two things that were completely left out, I think that maybe need to be touched on. All the sort of pro housing production policies. This is the increase in FAR, residential floor area ratio in New York City and Manhattan. So the regulatory relief for the hotels, that wasn't included in there, and also the ADU legislation, which, you know, probably sort of is in the news pretty big as something that the governor pushed. These things were all left out of the one house bills for the Assembly and the Senate, which is something we weren't very happy about. And it seems that these things will be much more long-term goals that will probably have to happen outside of a budget season. Just for the sake of time and hurry up and just mention some things that Assembly put forth, the Senate didn't. There's a new Foundations for Our Futures program that the Assembly put $1 billion towards. This is, I think, best described as sort of a Mitchell Lama 2.0. I can, in the Q&A, I can talk about that program more if people are interested in exactly what that does. The COLA mentioned, the Assembly actually included supportive housing workers into that cost adjustment increase, which is something that does not exist and isn't included in the Assembly, I mean, in the executive budget or the Senate budget, which is huge for our supportive housing workers. They also included $50 million for eviction outside of New York City, which is, you know, similar to bringing up New York City's, you know, universal eviction representation, which we have, and bringing that more towards outside the state. So we're looking with that funding amount for the Assembly was great. I think just skipping to the Senate has the Community Land Trust Acquisition Funds, which we really think is super important when it comes to helping out the Community Land Trust movement and sort of seeing it grow as a way of providing permanent affordable housing. They put $45 million towards that. And yeah, I think those are the main programmatic differences. Yeah, thanks for having us. I think moving forward, the big thing is the total amounts, especially in the Assembly bill, are very large, and the amount that goes into savings and not seems to be the big thing, not exactly differences over programs. So it's really about the total amount more than seeing programs get cut or not right now.
All right, Isaiah, thank you so much. And our final speaker is David Kalik, who will talk to us about the Excluded Worker Fund, which I understand is not in anybody's budget right now. But David, if you could just give us a couple minutes on this. Great.
Sure, thanks so much. So I really feel like this is a new moment in the country for including undocumented immigrants in social insurance. I mean, the last year was kind of amazing. This huge recognition that many people pay into the benefits but don't ever get them. I think a new level of appreciation for essential work and how people were, you know, how work that goes underappreciated as part of everyday lives. Black Lives Matter, I think, really put a focus on the way that who's excluded from unemployment insurance is the very definition of structural racism. It excludes workers in job categories like domestic work or farm work that had a dramatically disparate racial impact without saying a word about race, and is still with us today, you know, many decades after it was put into the initial unemployment insurance. So when unemployment insurance was expanded and extended last year, undocumented immigrants were very specifically left out. And many states responded, but New York really led the nation with this $2.1 billion fund. 130,000 people got the fund last year, but it ran out before the job was done. It ran out for kind of a good reason, which is that there were two tiers of benefits, one equivalent to what people got in unemployment insurance if they were unemployed for the year, and the other at a much lower amount. And to our pleasant surprise, the Department of Labor was working with community groups and actually made it possible for people to get tier 1 benefits almost exclusively. 99% of the people who got benefits got tier 1 benefits. So evidence of the success of the program for people who got it is rolling in. At Immigration Research Initiative, we just did a report with the Urban Institute showing how effective and impactful it was. The recession, the recession is not over. The pandemic is not over either. But even those who did get back to work, we saw, wound up with this mound of debt. So it's not too late. It's in fact really crucial for people to get something right now. As Peter mentioned, it is, I'm sure you know, not in any of the budgets. We're not terribly hopeful about the idea of getting the $3 billion that would allow all 175 people who didn't qualify to get a chance to get the funds. But we're at least somewhat hopeful that there's discussion about the 75,000 people who are already in the system, who look like they qualify, but were just, just didn't get there fast enough. And so the funds ran out before they got there. I think we also, I hope you've also heard about the idea of excluded no more, a way of taking the one-time fund for people who were unemployed last year and making it into a more lasting kind of program that would provide benefits like that on an ongoing basis. The cost estimate for that is $800 million a year. It's much less, to many people's surprise, just because even though it would cover undocumented workers and also some other categories of workers who are excluded from unemployment benefits, in a normal year, you don't have anything like the kind of unemployment that we had in the midst of the pandemic. And so, if we figure it's something like 50,000 people a year, that's I think a very conservative estimate about actually of how many people would need it. So, I hope you saw the front page of the Times-Union today. The news was the television news. I think we were on every channel last night. Even though it's not in any of the budgets, we hope that there's still some chance, at least for the $75,000. I'm sorry, 75,000 people for this year, and we think that we're laying the groundwork for next year to be the year that Excluded No More becomes a permanent program.
Thank you. I'd like to just indulge people, if we're going to run this over just a little bit, and I'd like to ask if people could pose a question here. Please just go for it. Put your hand up. If you must leave, I would understand, but we wanted to at least let people ask some questions. So go ahead. Anybody? Sir, somebody have their hand up?
I have my hand up.
Oh, Mark, go. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Isaiah, thanks for your presentation. You did a great job. One term that I just learned about recently, and I've been working on homelessness and housing for over 30 years, so I think other people may not be aware, is the ADU. So can you describe what an ADU is, and the fact that there's no action on the budget this year is certainly something that we all need to know about and work on. Could you give us more detail on what that is?
Yeah, sure. ADU meaning standing for accessory dwelling unit. This is pretty popular in California. They've done a lot of legislation to push its use, and it's grown a lot. Just like granny flats, homes, units that are inside of garages. It's grown to include also, basement units, cellar units, just colloquially. And the idea was to force cities and municipalities to create zoning category for these, so that homeowners could create them. And, they're a great source of sometimes very cheap housing for a lot of folks, and places that, are zoned for single family only.
Right.
And as the terrible things that happen because of the hurricane and parts of New York City, it also impacts that as well, because we want to make some of these units legal, as well as making sure that they're safe. So that'd be one way of doing that. But there's a lot of pushback from parts of Long Island and other areas.
So at this point, someone can't even have someone else live in their home unless they are a family member and considered one family unit. You couldn't even theoretically have your cousin move into a room in your house because they're another family unit, and therefore illegal to have them stay with you unless they're part of your immediate family. Those kinds of limitations, right? They're pretty difficult.
Well, no,
Not legal.
I think it's about building something additional on your home.
Well, it's also
Not-
a family unit in your garage or something. It's not even the building. It's really having families that are not considered your family
Well, you
to
could
live there.
they could technically live there. It's just you wouldn't be able to rent the unit out.
Right, rent them.
But
Yes, exactly.
But
Right.
as you know, as Peter I think is going to mention that it's usually meant for these really small homes that are on a lot in your backyard or something like that. But
Mhm.
um,
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
great. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to try one. Ron, I want to know, having listened to this, where do you think the greatest possibilities are of the legislature and the governor coming together here?
Wow. I don't have a crystal ball. I could consult my disco ball, perhaps, but I've long since destroyed my crystal ball when it comes to trying to figure out where
Yeah.
each agreement. I'm hopeful that on some of the economic development reforms, especially given that the ones in the one houses are generally focused on transparency and accountability, that Governor Hochul might come around to some of that. But I think, as everybody can see right now, the bail reform issue and the governor's kind of surprise announcements on making some reforms to the existing law have really thrown a wrench into the budget negotiations. So my understanding, after talking to numerous members today, was that this is really all they're talking about right now, and they're trying to come to some sort of conclusion on that. But I think that it's really sucking a lot of the oxygen out of the room, as it were, in terms of the budget negotiations themselves. So, I think the hope is that, we can come together on a lot of these issues, right? Because they're for change. We're not really kind of fighting over scraps anymore. I mean, there's a substantial amount of money available, maybe not to do all of the things that we necessarily want to do, but there's certainly enough money to do a lot of the things that we need to do. And I think the governor needs to come around as well and potentially, realize that, putting all our eggs into this rainy day fund or the billions that she wants to put in may not be prudent right now because of the dramatic need that's out there. And quite frankly, we've gone through 10 years of really austerity budgets that have really left so many out in the cold that, my hope is that she will come around on some of these spending issues. So.
Okay.
Peter, I just want to add, I think I had some conversations today and last week with Senate staff, and it feels like they're saying that staff is going to be working around the clock this weekend, but really hoping to have it printed out by Monday. So, yeah, it feels like time is now for advocacy for all that last minute pushing.
Yeah, I also understand that there'll be a message of necessity from the governor, so the bills won't have to age for 3 days. So my guess is that I'm going to be spending a very late night Friday night at the Capitol. And once again, we'll see what's been affectionately dubbed the Big Ugly, which is the final bill. They'll come to agreement on the things that they normally reach agreement on rapidly. And then there will be this final bill called the Big Ugly that basically contains all the more contentious issues in it that will be voted on last and probably be the most hotly debated as well.
Mhm.
Again, this is one of those things where they jam everything into one final bill in order to gain support from people that might not otherwise support it.
I have a question for Mr. Thompson. Could you explain about the hotels converting over to affordable housing?
Yeah. Great. good
Sure.
question.
I think it's split into two things. There's the Honda bill, which is just passed or earlier, I think last year, which is just about trying to spend money to help developers and organizations convert hotels, which were doing very poorly during the pandemic, into affordable housing with like agreements to ensure that it'll be affordable for a long time. The problem has been that the bill sort of has these restrictions on what the units have to be like, and hotel rooms just are not easily turned into livable units that would be legally allowed to be called units in the city. So I think they're trying to close on one project now, but they've yet to spend any of that money. The legislation that the executive budget had included in it included ways to sort of make it a little bit easier for some of these to be converted, specifically in parts of Manhattan. So it's those, and then also there's some language about converting offices as well into housing. So, trying to take advantage of this time where there are some hotels that are just sort of may not be ever coming back to what they once were, and same thing with office spaces, as we have sort of this change in how we're working and where people are working. But I think it's still going to be sort of like a long-term question. It doesn't seem to be something that's going to be in the final budget.
Hey,
Okay.
Mark, I see your hand.
I think Neil had his hand up before me, then I'll go.
Oh, Neil, go
Thanks,
ahead.
Mark. Good to see you, Mark. I want to ask Ron Deutsch this question. Do you think that a lot of, because I do mostly criminal justice reform, I see parole reform wasn't even touched, you leave the house. But I was curious to, if these are not in the budget, do you see the likelihood of anything going on the standalone? Either in any of these bills that have been talked about here today? It doesn't have to be specifically criminal justice, but in housing, just on standalone, not in the budget.
Yeah,
Ron.
that's a good question. What can wait till after April 1 or will wait till after April 1 and what
Yeah.
sticks here?
I
Yeah,
think the rule of thumb has always been if it has fiscal implications or requires substantial amounts of money, that it would be in the budget. If it is strictly a policy issue, oftentimes that can get punted to the post-budget period, April through June. We'll be discussing a lot of public policy issues that may not have fiscal implications. That said, when an issue is controversial, the hope is to get it into the budget. So, that's where all the horse trading, as it were, takes place. So the goal, I think, is always to get something in the budget and not necessarily have to deal with it post-budget. But I think this is going to be a very active kind of post-budget session that we're going to see here in New York, because there's going to be a lot of issues that might not make it into the final budget, but are going to be hotly debated afterward.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
all right. Mark, I'm going to give you the last question.
Okay, well, just to pick up on what Ron was saying just now before I asked my question, which I don't even remember anymore, but maybe it'll come back. In recent years, the legislative leaders have tried to shy away from including policy issues in the budget if they really don't have any kind of significant connection to spending or taxes or anything like that. Former Governor Cuomo was famous for trying to shove policy initiatives into the budget process because the way the budget process is structured, the governor has disproportionate power in that process as a vis-a-vis the legislature. So I wouldn't at all be surprised if they set aside a lot of stuff until after the budget is done, because the legislative leaders are really trying to shy away from that and not go down that route anymore. And then, of course, we have a shortened post-budget session this year. Instead of it being almost 3 months, we have about 2 months. Actually, once they come back from their Easter Passover break, they will have about 6 weeks to do whatever they're going to do on everything else, because the primaries are at the end of June and they're due to adjourn by the first week in June. So I just wanted to flag that for people. And I do remember it's not so much a question, but just something I want to share about the budget process going forward that I've learned about today is that they are starting the round the clock staff and committee meetings and so forth tonight, starting at 9 o'clock. And we'll be going marathon through the weekend to try to get final bills starting to come out by early next week. It's usually a series of bills. They do a bunch of things that they agree on first and can kind of get them out of the way. And the bills nominally, I have titles that refer to different issue areas, but as the process goes forward, they cram something in here and there and yon, whether it fits or not. If they've got agreement, it goes forward. And then usually the last bill that they get to, which is the one Ron is talking about, which is where all the stuff ends up, where they had to do a lot of horse trading and there was contention and all that sort of stuff. They do want to try to get this done by April 1st, particularly the governor, for political reasons. Speculation is that she's worried about former governor breathing down her neck and potentially challenging her in the primary. And so she does not want to be appeared to have had a late budget. Now, that said, even under Governor Cuomo, they've often gone over a day or 2 or 3 before they finally get all the bills done. And the legislature has calendared itself to be in session the 4th, 5th, and 6th of April, which would be the first 3 days of that week. To do, and the speculation is that to the extent there may be spillover, that's when they would do it. And if they do get it done by then, they'll probably cancel those 3 days because they're usually, frankly, exhausted. We're all exhausted. The staff is exhausted. They'll just take that time off to kind of decompress, catch up on sleep, read through what they actually did, and et cetera. So that's just a little bit, someone was asking earlier about sort of the timeline and how it plays out. And yeah, technically they try to let the bills age for 3 days, but sometimes the governor can issue this message of necessity and they fast track it.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for all of your testimony and expertise. And we are recording this. And if you would like to take a look at it tomorrow to kind of go back over things and ponder what has been said here, please do so. Show up at the Capitol, call your legislators, call your governor, call the governor, and really push for the things that you care about. I think that, really we want to maybe not overspend in terms of things like the rainy day fund and tax cuts, and to release more resources that could then be placed into, I guess, what we call bottom-up investments like housing, like climate, like wages, like healthcare, and so on, which actually are much better economic drivers and probably will generate, frankly, much better tax revenue in the long term than some of these economic development projects that we are engaged in, which really don't have the same kind of return. So if you really just are a student of economics, asking about how we spend money and what kind of economic return you get from spending that money is something, a good framework, I think, to look at when you're talking with your legislators. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to close this out. Thanks for holding on a little longer, but we wanted to, really give this a full airing. So thanks so much for everyone.
Thank you, Peter.
You're welcome. Thanks,
Yes, thanks,
Richard.
Peter.